This episode is called After the Bell. On the afternoon of March 2nd, 2000, Kayla St. Pierre could barely keep her eyes open as she sat in class at her elementary school in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Her throat felt scratchy and her limbs felt like lead, and it took all of 10-year-old Kayla's concentration just to understand what her teacher was saying. Kayla had woken up that morning feeling foggy and run down, but she went to school anyway because she hated to miss class. She toughed it out through a pop quiz, then PE class and lunch, but now she was fading fast. Her eyes drooped, and suddenly there was a hand on her shoulder. It was Kayla's teacher gently shaking her awake. The teacher told Kayla that she needed to go see the nurse, and inside, Kayla actually felt really relieved. Kayla stumbled out of class and shuffled down the hall to the nurse's office. She didn't understand how she could be so tired, and when she saw the nurse, she asked if she could just go home and go to bed. The nurse checked Kayla's pulse and took her temperature, then told Kayla she was going to call her mom. Kayla nodded and then curled up on her side on a cot against the wall, and she nodded off. She woke up to the sound of her mom in the hallway talking with the nurse about how Kayla might have the flu. Kayla tried to sit up to hug her mom when she came in the room, but her body felt too heavy. So Kayla's mom helped her to her feet, and then Kayla sort of held on to her mother as they left the school and went out to the family car. As they drove home, Kayla's mom tried to reassure her that everything was going to be fine. At home, Kayla dropped onto the couch and pulled a blanket up to her chin. Her mom turned on cartoons, gave her some aspirin, and went to warm up some soup as Kayla fell asleep again. When Kayla opened her eyes several hours later, she was still on the couch, but the TV was off, and her mother had tucked her in with a fluffy blanket and her favorite pillow. Kayla threw off the blanket so that she could go upstairs to her own bed, but something strange caught her eye. Now that the blanket was off of her, she could see that she had these bright purple spots all over one of her arms. She blinked and looked closer. They were small and dark, and there were dozens of them. As Kayla's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she suddenly noticed that her legs were covered in these purple spots too. Something was obviously wrong with her, and so she tried to yell out for her parents, but only a tiny whisper came out. She could barely make a sound. Then Kayla tried to get off the couch to go find her parents, but her legs were like jelly. She tried to wiggle her toes, but she couldn't. They didn't move. And so Kayla really began to panic as she lay there frozen. Using all her strength, Kayla did finally slide off the couch and onto the carpet, and from there she crawled her way across the room and up the stairs and all the way into her parents' room. Once she was in there, Kayla couldn't stand and she basically couldn't speak, so she just laid there on the floor in her parents' bedroom, banging her fist against their bed frame. Kayla's mom was initially confused about where this banging sound was coming from, but then she looked over the edge of her bed to find her daughter lying there on the floor. Kayla's mom asked Kayla, what are you doing down there? Kayla looked up at her mom, and even though she couldn't say the words, she mouthed the words as clearly as she could that she needed to go to the hospital. Suddenly, Kayla's mom and her dad, who was awake at this point, both realized that their daughter was in great danger, and they dove into action, turning on lights, throwing on clothes, grabbing car keys. Kayla's mom grabbed Kayla's shoes and crouched down and put them on her because Kayla couldn't move at all. And by this point, Kayla was just crying hysterically because she was so scared. She had never been this sick before. And then Kayla felt her dad pick her up, and he carried her down the stairs and put her in the backseat of the car. Then, moments later, Kayla's parents were in the car too, and they were on their way to the hospital. And as they drove, Kayla just hoped that whatever was going on with her was like all the other times she'd been sick, that a doctor would soon figure out what was wrong, they'd give her medicine, and her life would go back to normal. As Kayla's family was racing toward Lawrence General Hospital, Dr. Michelle Harris was filling out the medical chart for a 10-year-old girl named Terralyn who had been brought to the same hospital a couple of hours earlier. Terralyn's symptoms were very serious and very strange. She had a 105-degree fever, she had intense fatigue, and she had a purple spot on her shoulder. Dr. Harris had started her on antibiotics and ordered full blood work. She hoped once the test came back that she'd have a better idea of what was going on with her young patient. Once Dr. Harris was done with the paperwork, she headed to the break room to get a cup of coffee, something she desperately needed when she worked overnight shifts in the emergency room. But before she could take her first sip, a nurse flagged her down. A new patient named Kayla St. Pierre had just arrived in the ER, and Dr. Harris was needed immediately. Dr. Harris thanked the nurse and quickly went to the ER, where she found Kayla in a sweaty, pale heap on a bed. Her parents stood on either side of her, looking terrified and exhausted. Dr. Harris introduced herself and asked Kayla how she was feeling, but Kayla could barely turn her head to look at the doctor. She mumbled that her body hurt and her arms and legs felt weird. Dr. Harris pushed up the sleeves on Kayla's hospital gown to get a better look at her, and when she did this, Dr. Harris did a double take. Her arms were covered in purple splotches, sort of like that one purple dot that was on her other patient's shoulder, Terrelyn. Dr. Harris studied the markings on Kayla's arms and her legs more closely and realized that she recognized the condition from medical school. These splotches were a type of blood vessel disorder called purpuric lesions, and they typically appeared in patients whose bodies were fighting off some sort of serious infection. Next, Dr. Harris examined Kayla's hands and feet. They were cold to the touch and darker than the rest of her body, indicating poor blood circulation. Dr. Harris checked Kayla's fingers, wrists, toes, and ankles, but couldn't find a strong pulse anywhere. Dr. Harris had a sinking feeling as she recognized what was happening to this young girl. She took Kayla's parents aside and told them that Kayla's symptoms all pointed to a rare, fast-moving condition called meningococcal meningitis. Kayla's parents did not know what this disease was, so Dr. Harris spelled out the dangers that now lay ahead for Kayla. Meningitis happens when bacteria invades the membrane that protects the spinal cord and the brain. From there, the bacteria can spread into the bloodstream and trigger a runaway infection called sepsis. The purple splotches on Kayla's skin suggested that that was already happening, and if this was left untreated, meningococcal meningitis could be fatal. Dr. Harris told Kayla's parents that the most important next step was to determine how advanced this infection was. To do that, Kayla would need something called a spinal tap, which would allow the doctors to actually see the fluid in her spine. Kayla's parents looked completely overwhelmed by what Dr. Harris had said, and they clung to each other for support. But they both nodded and told the doctor to do whatever she had to save their daughter. Less than an hour later, Dr. Harris delicately pulled back the plunger on a syringe stuck between two bones of Kayla's spine. The girl's spinal fluid began trickling into the syringe and then through a plastic tube on its way to a vial that would be sent to the lab for analysis. And the moment Dr. Harris saw the liquids swirling into the vial, she knew this was a bad case. Kayla's spinal fluid was cloudy, not clear like it was supposed to be. Cloudy cerebrospinal fluid was a sign there was a serious infection in the body, which was exactly what Dr. Harris feared. Dr. Harris handed the vial to a nurse to bring down to the lab, but to be honest, the patient herself had already told the doctor all she needed to know. Kayla was clearly getting weaker and more exhausted, and her fingers and feet were turning even darker. If Dr. Harris didn't act fast, they could lose Kayla in just the next few hours. Dr. Harris glanced out the window and saw there was barely a hint of sunrise out on the horizon. Dr. Harris then told a nurse to bring her antibiotics, blood pressure medication, and an intubation tube, which would pump extra oxygen into Kayla's lungs. Dr. Harris hoped all these together would help get more blood to Kayla's fingers, toes, and organs. But Dr. Harris knew that all these measures alone would not be enough to save Kayla. Dr. Harris took Kayla's parents aside again and told them that she thought it was time for Kayla to be transferred to Boston Children's Hospital, one of the country's leading pediatric medical centers. It was always risky to move patients in such a fragile condition, but given Kayla's rapid decline, Dr. Harris felt like there was no other choice. And the doctor told Kayla's parents some very sobering news. She said they had to move quickly because their daughter very likely only had about a 10% chance of surviving the next 24 hours. When Kayla's mother heard this, she lowered her face in her hands and began to cry. Once Kayla was safely loaded into the ambulance for the ride to Boston, early on the morning of March 3rd, Dr. Harris said goodbye to Kayla and Kayla's parents, and then hurried back to check on her other young patient, Terrelyn. Dr. Harris hoped she was holding up better than Kayla. But as soon as Dr. Harris stepped into the hospital room, she could see that Terrelyn's condition had actually worsened. She looked at the monitor and saw that Terrelyn's heart rate was now much higher than it was before, and her blood pressure had dropped dangerously. Dr. Harris pulled back the neckline of Terrelyn's hospital gown to check that purple spot on her shoulder, and she could see that there were now many more spots. In fact, Terrelyn's entire body was now covered with these alarming bruise-like spots. And so Dr. Harris had no doubt that Terrelyn and Kayla were suffering from the same disease. Dr. Harris felt both worried and confused to have two young patients with meningococcal meningitis on the same night. The entire state of Massachusetts only reports about 75 cases of this disease in the entire year. 2 cases in the same night at the same hospital just could not be a coincidence. Dr. Harris worried that these 2 cases might just be the first in a whole wave of cases because of how easily meningococcal meningitis spreads. Just coughing or sharing a drink or snack or even just being close to someone carrying the bacteria is enough to spread it. Both girls' parents had told Dr. Harris that their daughters had attended school the day before they got sick, and they both attended the James F. Hennessy Elementary School, which meant any number of students and teachers and staff at the school could now also be infected. And so Dr. Harris realized the time had come to sound the alarm. So she ran to her office and she dialed the number for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. That same morning, Dr. Charles Dayton was still at home getting dressed when the phone rang. It was one of his assistants at the Department of Public Health. 2 girls had been rushed to Boston Children's Pediatric Intensive Care Unit during the night with life-threatening cases of meningitis. Both girls went to the same school in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and they had both attended school the day before they got sick. The thought of hundreds of kids catching and spreading a potentially fatal disease made Dr. Dayton's heart start to race. But he had faced enough urgent healthcare crises before to know that worrying about them didn't help anybody. He needed to take swift action, especially since school started in just 90 minutes. Dr. Dayton dialed the number for James F. Hennessy Elementary School and asked to speak to the principal. When the principal hopped on the call, Dr. Dayton explained the situation as calmly as he could manage, but the principal was obviously still alarmed to learn that 2 of her students were gravely ill with a contagious condition. The doctor told the principal that he would need to know more about Kayla and Terrelyn. Once he understood how these girls were connected, beyond just going to the same school, he could begin to figure out how they had both contracted the meningococcal meningitis bacteria. Comparing the schedules of the girls would also help determine who they came into contact with, and therefore who was at greater risk of now getting sick. The principal put Dr. Dayton on hold while she went to get the girls' files. Moments later, she came back on the line with surprising news. Kayla and Terrelyn had almost no contact in school. The girls were in different grades, so they had no classes in common, and they also took lunch and recess at different times. Except for possibly passing each other in the hall, it didn't seem like their paths ever crossed during a normal day of school. Dr. Dayton was puzzled. If Kayla and Terrelyn were never together, then how did they both get infected with the same deadly bacteria? The doctor would have to investigate more thoroughly later, but for now, he had more pressing concerns, such as preparing a school for the arrival of 550 students, some of whom might already be carrying a deadly, highly contagious infection. If he had received the news earlier, Dr. Dayton would have considered ordering the school closed, but it was too late for that. It would cause too much chaos. For now, it was best to take normal safety precautions. Dr. Dayton told the principal to have all the bathrooms scoured and disinfected and the water fountains turned off. Then he asked the principal to send his office a master class list so the doctor and his team could try to figure out who had come into closest contact with Kayla and Terrelyn. After Dr. Dayton hung up, he quickly finished getting dressed, then drove to his office at the health department. By the time he got there, his team was already assessing the student list that the principal had sent over, and they had discovered that 82 students and 7 teachers shared classrooms or facilities with either Terrelyn or Kayla. All of them were flagged as potential carriers of meningococcal meningitis. Dr. Dayton told his team to contact the parents of all 82 students and advise them to take their kids to a pediatrician so they could get antibiotics. Then he called the principal back and told her that all 7 teachers who had taught Kayla and Terrelyn needed to be dismissed for the entire day and remain off campus until they'd been tested for meningitis. As word of the meningitis scare trickled out into the school community, Dr. Dayton's phone rang constantly with calls from parents wanting more information. He explained as best as he could, and he reassured them that if their kids took the recommended antibiotics, they'd be fine. But later that afternoon, Dr. Dayton began receiving a different type of call. Local pharmacies were contacting him to warn that they had sold through their entire stock of antibiotics. Parents kept showing up, but there was nothing for the pharmacies to give them. At the crack of dawn the next day, Dr. Dayton's cell phone rang. It was a colleague from the state health department, confirming that the state had just ordered an emergency shipment of antibiotics for Lawrence area pharmacies. A fleet of trucks had just left their warehouses, loaded with drugs to fight off meningitis. Dr. Dayton spent a long day at his desk, confirming deliveries of antibiotics, but also fielding calls from local reporters who had found out about the meningitis cases from parents in the area. Dr. Dayton did his best to spread a message of confidence that the situation was under control, but in reality, he didn't actually know if it was. On the morning of March 5th, so 3 days after Kayla St. Pierre first got sick, Dr. Dayton got a call he'd been dreading. It was a doctor from a nearby hospital calling about a young girl who had been brought to their emergency room in the middle of the night, and her lab reports had just finished processing, and the doctor could now confirm that she had meningococcal meningitis. Then the physician said something else that alarmed Dr. Dayton even more. Although this third girl with meningitis was from Lawrence, Massachusetts, she actually went to a different school than Kayla and Terrelyn. This meant that the meningitis was spreading to a new pool of victims. Dr. Dayton feared what might come next. A third school? A fourth? Then spreading to other towns and maybe even across state lines? Who knew how far this could go? Now it was Sunday, but Dr. Dayton knew he couldn't wait for Monday to take action. So he thanked the doctor, hung up, and then quickly called an emergency weekend meeting at the health department headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts. Once Dr. Dayton got to his office, he pinned a map up showing the two schools up on the wall. He paced the room, wondering how Kayla and Terrelyn could have caught the same bacteria despite not sharing any classes or activities. And now there was this third girl from a totally different school who had somehow caught the same bacteria. And so the only explanation that made sense was that these three girls had something in common, just nobody knew what it was yet. Dr. Dayton stared at the schools on the map, lost in thought. Then an idea occurred to him. If the girls hadn't interacted at school, what if they knew each other outside of school? Dr. Dayton told his team to contact the parents of all three girls and find out every extracurricular activity they were involved in, from sports to neighborhood groups to Girl Scouts. Dr. Dayton felt certain there had to be some social thread connecting them, and if they could find it, then they had a chance to contain the outbreak. The next morning, Dr. Dayton was working in his office when he got word that another girl from a city near Lawrence had just been admitted to the hospital with a 104-degree fever. And after taking a spinal tap, a doctor confirmed her diagnosis. She too had meningococcal meningitis. Dr. Dayton slumped in his chair. This was the fourth case in 4 days, with no end in sight. Dr. Dayton desperately needed to find the source of the infection, but every new patient made the puzzle more complicated. The third girl was from a different school than Kayla and Terrelyn, and now today's girl, the fourth girl, was from a different community altogether. Dr. Dayton still felt like all of these girls must be connected somehow. He just needed to figure out what the connection was, and he needed to find it fast. Dr. Dayton called his team together again for another brainstorming meeting. To him, the biggest clue was the fact that all four girls had gotten sick within a very small window of time, which suggested they might have been exposed around roughly the same timeline. He also knew that meningococcal meningitis can take about 2 weeks until victims begin to show symptoms, which meant all these girls were likely exposed roughly 2 weeks earlier. So Dr. Dayton called in his best research assistant and told him to find out what each of the four girls were doing 14 days ago. As his research assistant left to get started, Dr. Dayton's phone rang yet again. It was Kayla's doctor at Boston Children's Hospital, and he had some very upsetting news. The majority of Kayla's fingers and toes had been without a proper blood supply for so long that the tissue inside had died, and it looked like they would have to amputate them. Dr. Dayton thought for a moment about poor Kayla. Less than a week ago, she was probably roller skating and riding her bike like any healthy 10-year-old, and now she was about to become permanently disabled. And the possibility that this might happen to even more kids on his watch made Dr. Dayton almost nauseous. Later that afternoon, there was a knock on Dr. Dayton's office door. His research assistant came in, and to Dr. Dayton's surprise, the assistant looked excited. He said he had just discovered a very strong lead. It turned out all 4 girls were part of the same local girls' club. Not only that, but exactly 2 weeks ago, 3 of the 4 girls had taken a girls' club field trip together to go see Disney on Ice in New York City. Dr. Dayton felt so excited that he nearly cheered. This had to be where the girls were infected. But he still needed to find out how they had transmitted the bacteria to each other. He stood up, grabbed his car keys, and went to find out. Less than an hour later, Dr. Dayton parked at Boston Children's Hospital and hurried inside. 3 of the 4 girls were there. Kayla's case was the worst, and she had actually just been put into a medically induced coma. Doctors had decided this was her body's only chance to fight back against the disease. Dr. Dayton went to Terrelyn's room and found her lying on her side, flipping through a magazine. She looked pale and weak, but her vitals were stable. Dr. Dayton asked her about the trip to New York. Terrelyn sat up in bed and smiled at the memory. She described how fun the long bus ride there had been, and how exciting it was to cross the bridge into the city, seeing it all lit up at night. Dr. Dayton asked if the girls had brought snacks or drinks along, or if maybe they had stopped at some point to buy them. He assumed the bacteria had likely spread through something the girls had consumed. But Terrelyn shook her head. She said they had been too excited to eat or drink anything. Besides, they hadn't wanted to spill anything on their outfits, since they had dressed up in their favorite clothes. Dr. Dayton was puzzled. If the girls hadn't shared any food or drink, then how did the bacteria spread? Terrelyn told him that as their bus approached Madison Square Garden, where the show was going to take place, that she and the other girls had fixed their hair and touched up their appearance to get ready. When Dr. Dayton asked her to describe exactly what they'd done to get ready, Terrelyn mentioned something that really caught the doctor's attention. He asked a few quick follow-up questions to confirm some details about this thing she had mentioned, but as he scribbled down everything she was saying, he felt like this has to be it. This had to be the source of the sickness. Finally, Dr. Dayton thanked Terrelyn and then hurried to the lobby to call his office and tell them that he'd just found the cause of the outbreak. For the next 2 weeks, Dr. Dayton kept waiting for his phone to ring with news of another case, but it never happened. After 14 days with no new cases, Dr. Dayton knew the scare was over. He felt both relieved and exhausted. It would turn out his hunch had been correct. All 4 cases of meningococcal meningitis were due to a single isolated event. Right before the Disney on Ice performance, Terrelyn, Kayla, and one of the other girls had shared a tube of sparkly lip gloss to look extra glamorous for the night. And that lip gloss was contaminated with the meningococcal meningitis bacteria. Most likely, the one sick girl who was not on the field trip had also used that same tube of lip gloss sometime shortly before or after. Although Dr. Dayton was grateful to have identified the bacteria's source, he was left with one question unanswered: how the bacteria got on the lip gloss in the first place. Now, Dr. Dayton was never actually able to determine this for certain, but he guessed that someone who did not know they had meningitis must have used that lip gloss at some point. Some people carry the bacteria without ever actually getting sick themselves, even though they can spread the disease. But the bacteria was there, living on that tube of lip gloss, until the fateful day it was passed around before Disney on Ice. 3 of the girls would make full recoveries, but unfortunately Kayla would lose both her legs, 8 of her fingers, and all function in her kidneys. She underwent 50 operations and was bedridden in multiple hospitals for 11 months. But thanks to a successful kidney transplant, Kayla's body did finally begin healing, and today she actually works with the National Meningitis Association, helping educate others about the dangers of the disease that took so much from her. Many people have claimed over the years to have been abducted by aliens, and realistically there's no tangible evidence that any human being has ever actually set foot in an extraterrestrial spacecraft or another dimension or anything like that. It's just these crazy stories from people that claim this happened to them. And while many of these stories are very quickly cast aside as absolute hoax, not true, not accurate, there's one story, one abduction story that is universally regarded as the most believable and most famous alien abduction story, and that is of Travis Walton. What made this case so famous is that unlike all of the other alien abduction cases where there was never any proof, it was usually one person's first-hand account. In this case, you have a full-scale police investigation. You have up to 16 lie detector tests that were taken by Travis Walton himself, along with the other witnesses and people that were there. And you have a group of 6 level-headed guys that actually witnessed the abduction take place and have stuck to their story and have passed all lie detector tests and have never changed their story in 40 years. And you would think that at some point you might change your story because they came under incredible scrutiny. I mean, it basically derailed most of their careers and their lives because they were labeled as crazy people for believing that a UFO had abducted Travis Walton. I mean, in a way, they became famous, but in all the worst ways. So you have all these elements that make this story seem fairly credible. And even if this wasn't an alien abduction, let's say, how do you account for the past lie detector tests that are talking about UFOs? How do you account for the fact that Travis Walton was really missing for 5 days and has no idea where he was? And there was a full search effort to find him in the area where he would have been. So lots of unanswered questions, but the story itself of when he was actually abducted, and then his own story about what happened once he had been abducted, it makes for just an incredible story. It's been converted into books and movies, and to this day, it remains one of, if not the single most fascinating purported alien abduction stories ever. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3 to 4 of these stories every week. So if that's something that interests you, I would encourage you to gently extirpate the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive into the story. By 1975, Travis Walton, who was 22 years old at the time, had developed a bad boy reputation in his hometown of Snowflake, Arizona. He rode a noisy Harley-Davidson motorcycle through town. He was a wild bull rider and he was a boxer. And there was this story about Travis when he was with his friends in a car and they were driving down this road and a bear jumped out of the woods and landed in the middle of the road and was just standing there. And Travis, without any hesitation, leaps out of his car and chases after this huge bear and scares it into the woods, and in fact chased it up into the woods. So Travis was just known as this kind of rebel, problem child a little bit, but he was beloved by his friends. He was just like one of those cool guys that he did it his own way. So Travis and the 6 other men that he worked with were loggers. They were given contracts and they would go out and they would clear trees in a certain area. They were not big time with huge equipment to do this. We're talking chainsaws, regular saws and axes. And they would just go out, these blue collar, like hard working type guys, and they would clear areas of trees. That's what they did. Now these 7 men, they did a dangerous job. I mean, you're cutting down these huge trees and you're usually working pretty quickly. You're operating, chainsaws that are pretty dangerous. And Mike Rogers, who was the crew boss, who was there the day of this event, he described in a number of his interviews that, the men that he hired to do these jobs, they needed to be incredibly level-headed. They did not strike you as people that would have this fantastical, alien encounter story. On November 5th, 1975, Mike Rogers was given a contract to clear out this huge 1,200-acre plot of land inside of the Sitgreaves National Forest. And he grabbed his crew, they piled into the one pickup truck that Mike owned, and Mike knew that this was going to be a really, really difficult job. It was a huge area to cover, and he told his men up front, we're going to be working really, really hard, so expect long, full days. And so over the first 3 days of the job, even though they were working, long hours and barely taking any breaks, they were behind schedule. At the end of this third day, it's late at night, they've worked all day, and everybody is just totally exhausted. And so finally they wrap up, and they all pile back into Mike's truck, all 7 of them, and they start driving the access road back down to the main road to get back to the town. And as they're driving, they're not really talking about work at all. They're kind of joking about what they're going to do that night. And as they're driving down the road, and again, it's heavily forested, they look off to the right, and there is some lights in the forest. They would say in interviews that they all noticed it, but it did not stand out as anything particularly bad. It just could be anything. They weren't thinking about it. But as they were driving down this road and this light, I guess, got brighter, or maybe they couldn't help but notice it, they all started commenting on this light, and they're looking at it, and somebody suggested that, oh, it's probably just the moon, it's a full moon. But then one of the guys on the other side of the truck happened to look out his side, away from where that light was, and he goes, no, the moon's over here, it's on this side of the road. So they're like, okay, it's not the moon. And then someone suggested, oh, well, maybe it's a forest fire. Like, maybe we should go check it out, that could be a forest fire. But then Mike Rogers, the driver, the crew boss, was like, no, there'd be smoke, there's no smoke or anything. And Travis, who, he's the guy that's jumping out of cars to go chase down bears, and he's like a total kind of adrenaline junkie type. He's like, hey, let's just drive over there and see what it is. Like, I don't know, it could be anything. Let's go check it out. The guys in the truck were a little on edge about it, but ultimately said, what's the harm? We'll drive over. We know there's a road that brings us over to that section of the forest. We'll get a look at whatever this is, and then we'll leave. So they drive down this other little access road, and they come to a clearing where these lights were, and they are astounded at what they see. They were all polygraphed separately about what they saw when they reached this clearing. Each of them described the same thing with slightly different details because it's from their own perspective, and the polygraph tests all showed that they were telling the truth. They saw this disc-shaped craft with what looked like panels of lights on the underside, hovering in a clearing maybe 50 or 100 feet off the ground, not spinning or anything, just floating in midair, as if it was suspended. And the men, in their interviews later on TV shows and books, they would say what struck them was not just the fact that there's this craft here, but how bizarre it was to see this thing defying gravity. It's not moving, but it's hovering over the air, and it's right in front of us. And one of the men even commented at length, because he would build houses, and he was a handy guy. And he started talking about the structural framework of this craft. He could see that there was really impressive engineering on the underside of this craft. It was just this beautiful, beautiful machine. And they're looking at it, and Travis is so excited when they get to this clearing. He doesn't even know what he's looking at, but much like the bear, where he jumps out and chases the bear, as soon as they were almost at a stop in this clearing right next to the ship, he's jumping out of the car. Nobody else is, just Travis. And he starts walking just a little ways away from the car towards this craft. The craft doesn't move. The craft is maybe, from where they parked, maybe 50 or 100 feet away from them, and then 50 or 100 feet in the air. And the crew doesn't say anything. They're just dumbfounded by what they're looking at. Travis is also dumbfounded, but he's walking towards the ship. And he would say in an interview that he was frightened, but he was mostly curious. He knew he was looking at something that no one knew what it was. Some sort of craft, they didn't know what it was, but it was fascinating to him, and he kept walking closer and closer and closer to it. And as the crew kind of came out of their initial shock of seeing this unidentified flying object in the sky, they start yelling for Travis to come back. They had this bad sense that something was going to happen, and they thought, you shouldn't go near it, like, come back. Not to mention, it's hovering in the air. What if it falls and it lands on you? Like, hey, Travis, come back over here. And then it was like once one person started yelling for Travis to come back, they all did. And so Travis remembered hearing them screaming for him to come back to the car. But he's not really paying any attention. He's still walking. And finally he stops. He's just looking at it. And Travis would say he was just struck at just the beauty of the underside of this craft with all these different panels of lights built into it. It was this incredible piece of machinery. And he's looking at it, and then all of a sudden it starts spinning. Just a little bit, and it starts emitting this noise that all of them reported hearing, this loud mechanical sound. And now the yells from the crew are getting louder and louder, and Travis would say that he knew he needed to turn around and go back, but he just wanted to look for a few more seconds, and he was about to turn and go back to the truck when all of a sudden a beam of light comes out and strikes Travis like a lightning strike. And all of the crew saw this happen. He gets blown 20 feet away. Like he gets lifted off the ground and thrown 20 feet. And they watched it happen. And again, in all of their polygraph tests, they all said the same thing. All passed. He was hit by a ray of light from this UFO, knocked him 20 feet back. Mike Rogers, in a panic, along with everybody else in the crew, they just decide to leave. And they're convincing themselves, as Mike is driving away like a maniac, leaving Travis behind, they're convincing themselves that he's dead already. We just watched him get shot by something. We don't know what that is. And they're freaked out. They don't even know what they saw. They're crying. They're hysterical. These are grown men, just absolutely terrified. And they're driving a little ways until finally Mike just hits the brakes and he stops. And Mike is like, we have to go back for him. He was like, if you guys want to stay here and wait for me, that's fine. But this truck is going back to get Travis. And so the idea of waiting out in the open after seeing what they just saw was even worse than going back. They wanted to stay together. So a little bit begrudgingly, although they knew they needed to, they all got back in the truck, turned around and started driving back up to the UFO site. As they make it back up, they notice that there is no lights up there. The craft is gone and there's no Travis. And they get out, and now Mike is uncontrollably crying because he feels like they just abandoned him, and where did he go? Everybody else is in shock. They can't believe it. They start screaming for Travis. They're running around the woods, yelling for Travis, looking for signs of Travis. They really don't know what happened, but they know Travis is not here. And after a little bit of time of looking, they're like, we have to tell the police. And they knew that it was going to be bad for them when they told police. The story is, a UFO came and zapped Travis and now he's gone. That doesn't really sit well with police. But they knew, because they wanted to find Travis and they were very concerned about their friend, they knew they had to tell police. Mike and a few of the other crew were just unable to even think. They were crying, they were upset. And so finally they get to a payphone, the first payphone they saw, because it's 1975. And Ken Peterson, who was this very kind of simple, matter-of-fact guy, recently married, just very simple guy, very level-headed guy. He decides to call the police because he's the only one who was, I guess, composed enough to do it. And so he calls the sheriff's department and he says, you got to come out here. We can't find our friend Travis Walton. We'll have to describe it to you when you get here, because trying to do it over the phone is not going to do it justice. But he's gone and we don't know where he went. So shortly thereafter, Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and Ken Copeland, their partners, they show up at this rest stop where this payphone was, and they get to the scene. They see Ken Peterson, who made the call to them, and they're like, all right, tell us what's going on. The crew has now gotten out of the truck. They look distraught for sure. And Ken begins to try to describe what happened, but he hasn't said UFO, he hasn't said aliens. He's just said, we were up at the logging site, we had a contract up there, and then, just, it's hard to describe. And Mike Rogers jumps in. He's like, we saw a UFO and a ray of light hit Travis and then he disappeared. And the sheriffs are looking at them like, really? And so they stopped them and were like, all right, I need to search your truck to make sure you guys aren't under the influence of something. And they're like, we haven't done anything. We've been working all day. They search the truck, nothing. They check each of them to see if they're sober, and their field test showed they were all sober. And the Sheriff Gillespie, who was the overall in charge sheriff, even though he was a total skeptic, and so was Sheriff Copeland as well, he would say about that first engagement with the 6 crew members that they were obviously shaken up by something. Something had happened. They don't know what it was, but they were shaken up. And what Sheriff Gillespie believed was that they were creating a hoax to cover up a real crime. He believed that they had harmed Travis Walton and they were using a UFO to cover it up. But he also was thinking to himself, like, this is a bad hoax. It's not very well planned. They don't really have their stories really lined up particularly well. They're not doing a good job explaining it. The only thing they're doing well is acting scared. A couple hours later, the sun's starting to come up because it was super late when all this happened. And Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copland have organized this huge search effort up in the forest where Travis had gone missing. And the crew members, they're all there as well. A bunch of volunteers showed up and they are scouring the area. I mean, they got dogs out, they got these huge teams looking everywhere, and they can't come up with anything. I mean, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign, there's nothing from Travis. And so while this is all going on, Sheriff Copland and Sheriff Gillespie have started coming over to Mike Rogers and the rest of the crew and being like, hey, if you just tell us where Travis Walton's body is, like, we'll go easy on you guys. Like, we know you did it. And they can feel that the pressure is really mounting, that if they don't find Travis, even though they didn't do anything, according to their story, they're going to face serious repercussions because that's the way the world works. You don't get to say aliens did this and not have any blame placed on you because there's no proof. They just have their own eyewitness testimony. That's it. And so the crew has started to become very worried about what's going to happen. They're worried about Travis, of course, but they're starting to see that, like, they're going to be prosecuted for this unless they find Travis. And so they're all very stressed out. And they noticed during the search, this first day of searching, that these three guys wearing red jackets had these tools that were scanning the ground, almost like a metal detector. And Mike Rogers, he was hoping that during this investigation that they would have people come out that were like paranormal investigators. I guess maybe he was naive to think that the police would actually do that. But he thought, given the fact that we've all said this is a UFO that zapped Travis, who then disappeared, that they would have at least one person representing the kind of paranormal side of the investigation coming out. And so he sees these guys in red with their special tools that seem like a metal detector, and his gut says they're paranormal investigators. And so Mike goes over to them and he's like, hey, what are these tools you guys are doing? Like, what is this? And they look at him and they're like, oh, well, this tests for radiation. We're scanning for radiation in the area. And he asked them, like, well, what group are you guys with? Are you with the sheriff's department? And they just didn't really answer him. They said, oh, we're just checking for radiation in the area. This is just what we do. And Mike sees an opportunity because when that ship emitted that ray of light that ultimately blew Travis Walton 20 feet and then, evaporated him or something, they were within range of that big ball of lightning, and they were very much in the kind of cone where, had there been radiation coming off of that ship, he believed that perhaps they would have been hit with it. And so he asked the guys with the red jackets on and their little radiation tools to scan the crew's jackets and bodies to see if they were radioactive. And so the crew comes over and they scan them, and there's nothing. There's no trace elements of radioactivity. They're like, no, there's nothing. And then Mike realizes that from the time they called the sheriff until this search, they had all, the crew, gone home and changed, then come out to do this search. And so he thought, well, then, any of the radioactive materials would have been on our clothes, which aren't here, but we have our hard hats in the back of the truck that were out here the whole time. They were potentially exposed to whatever was out there from the ship. Can you test those? And so he brought over one of their helmets, and the guy in red scans his helmet, and the ticker goes all the way over, fully radioactive. And the guy in red looked up at Mike and looked down at the helmet, and he's scanning it and he's looking at him, kind of trying to size him up. And then he turns and he kind of gestures at the other two in red and tells them to stop doing what they're doing. And they come over and they're scanning the helmets as well. And then, without any indication of what the results were, what this meant, because Mike is kind of waiting for them to tell them what's going to happen, the guys in red just turn around and say, okay. And they just start walking away. And Mike's like, well, wait, what does this mean? And they don't turn around, and they just walk away from the search site. And so the other crew are watching this happen too. And Mike and the crew are trying to get them to come back, but they're not turning around. They're just leaving, and then they're gone. And so Mike goes over to the sheriffs, who they know the sheriffs think they did something to Travis. These are not their friends, but they figured we need to ask them who those guys in red were. So they go over to Sheriff Gillespie and they're like, hey, who were those guys in red jackets with the radiation detectors? And Sheriff Gillespie's like, who? There's no one here looking for radiation. Everyone here is here because I ordered them to be here. Who are they? Where are they? And he's like, well, they just walked over there. They went around the corner there. And Sheriff Gillespie's like, well, I didn't order them there. And it would turn out that they couldn't locate these three people. No one knew who they were. Mike went around and asked anybody who seemed like an authority figure if they knew who these people were. They asked people if they had interacted with them, and no one knew. So after this search that goes on for a couple of days, turns up nothing. There's no sign of Travis. The town of Snowflake, Arizona really turned on the 6 crew members. Everybody believed that they had done something to Travis, that this UFO thing was a hoax and that they harmed Travis and they were using this as a cover-up. And the sheriff department, they really perpetuated that. They were pretty open about, this is not a UFO situation, this is not an alien abduction, this is a missing person case, and frankly, we believe the UFO thing is a hoax. National and international media had picked this story up, and it became this massively viral story all over the world. And news media outlets are converging on Snowflake, Arizona, and they're inundating the sheriff's department with requests for more information about this alien abduction, and it's really frustrating the 2 sheriffs who are leading this investigation, Sheriff Gillespie and Sheriff Copland. And they were already skeptical and really upset about feeling like they were being taken advantage of by these crew members, this hoax, right? That's what they believed it was. And so Sheriff Gillespie and Copland decide, you know what? We're gonna just cut through all the BS here and we're gonna make these boys take a lie detector test. So they go out and get one of the country's best polygraph examiners to come in and administer a lie detector test on each of the 6 crew members. And so one by one over the course of the day, each crew member was tested for 2 hours, same questions, all centering on the criminal side, the kind of foul play angle for Travis Walton. They all go through it. And it turned out that 5 of the 6 had all shown that they were telling the truth. And the 6th person, it was just inconclusive. It didn't mean that he was lying. It just meant that the test wasn't done very well. And this polygraph examiner had anywhere from a 92 to 98% accuracy rate. He was one of the best in the country. And he even would say, it would be so difficult to fake that. To have 5 people, let's say this is all a big hoax and they harmed Travis Walton. It would be almost impossible to have 5 people be able to pass my examination and have nobody slip up. They were telling the truth. And so the examiner tells the sheriff, and Sheriff Gillespie is dumbfounded because he believed that they were going to find out they were all lying and that this could just be a pure criminal investigation and it would be, let's go find Travis Walton's body. But now the examiner is saying they're telling the truth. And so Detective Gillespie and his partner are like, now what do we do? And then 5 days after Travis's disappearance, Travis shows back up. During numerous interviews, Travis would say that he remembers waking up on a road and he didn't recognize where he was, but it was nighttime, it was raining, and he sensed a very bright light above him. And so as he's laying, he kind of turns his head to look up into the sky and he sees what looks like the underside of that ship, because he remembered how struck he was by the beauty of the kind of engineering underneath that disc UFO they saw in the forest. It looked the same. His vision was not great, but he's looking up and he's pretty confident that's what he's looking at. And then it flies into the sky and it's gone. And he's left in total darkness on a road in some place he doesn't know. And he remembers standing up and feeling very weak and depleted and dehydrated. And he just knew that he had to get to civilization. He had to just go in a direction and find someone who could help him because he was so weak and he would die out there if he didn't find someone who could help. And so he musters the strength to stand up and he starts kind of staggering down the road. And eventually, through just adrenaline, he just starts running. And luckily, he sees up ahead there is a rest stop. And at rest stops, there's payphones. And he makes his way down and he goes to the payphone and he has change in his pocket still. He puts it in the payphone and he ends up calling his brother. And his brother he can't believe he's talking to Travis because Travis is probably supposed to be dead at this point. He didn't believe it was Travis, but Travis just said to him over and over again, "It's me. They brought me back." And he tells him where he is because now he recognizes that this rest stop is actually in Snowflake, Arizona. When his brother picks him up, Travis would say that he believed that this was just minutes after, the initial abduction. He didn't even know he had been abducted. This is like he's coming to and he's like, man, what happened? Like, I was just over at that clearing where I saw this ship, and now I'm over here. Like, what am I doing here? And so Travis's brother is looking at him like, where have you been? You know, we've been so worried about you for the past several days. And Travis, who was kind of almost catatonic, you know, he's in shock. He doesn't know what's going on. He looks at his brother and he's like, what do you mean days? And his brother's like, you've been missing for 5 days. And so Travis would say that when he heard this news, this revelation that he had been missing for 5 days, it absolutely put him into shock. He was in a like catatonic state where he couldn't make sense of it. And so he just sat there quietly. And his brother's like looking at him, not really sure what to even ask. He asked a couple times what happened, and Travis just didn't answer because he didn't know. He couldn't explain it. And so Travis's brother decides, instead of just immediately calling the police, I want to bring you to a hospital because clearly that needs to happen. And frankly, with the media circus, as soon as they find out you're back, it's just going to be mayhem, and I want to make sure you're taken care of first. So he drives to Phoenix, Arizona, and he brings him to a hospital. And he asked the doctors to be discreet, and he has a doctor do an examination. The doctor knew who Travis Walton was because he'd been following the news. And he's doing an examination of Travis, and he was malnourished and he was tired and looked very sick. But there was no physical wounds, with the exception of he had one puncture site in his arm, in the crook of his arm. Travis was not a drug user, so it wasn't like that was, a mark from using drugs. It was a puncture site, and they assumed someone had recently put a needle in his arm. And also the doctor drug tested him and tested his blood, and there was no drugs in his system. It wasn't like he'd been using any sort of substance. So he kind of had a clear bill of health, minus the injection site and looking pretty ragged. And so after the examination, Travis's brother brings Travis back to his home in Phoenix, Arizona. As soon as they get back, his home phone is getting constant phone calls. It had made its way to the sheriff's department back in Snowflake, Arizona, and they are nonstop calling Travis's brother. Like, hey, we hear he's back. We have to talk to him. We have to talk to him. Sheriff Gillespie, he drives all the way to Phoenix. He goes in and he sits down to talk to Travis. And Sheriff Gillespie would say that Travis looked like he was in shock. He looked like he had been through something traumatic. It did not seem like he was acting. And he starts asking Travis what happened. And Travis, he does mention the UFO. He mentions seeing this thing in a clearing. He gets struck by some light. He doesn't know what it was. And then, he's on the road 5 days later, and he can't really make sense of what happened. He just didn't really know what happened over the 5 days. And finally, Sheriff Gillespie just kind of doesn't really give up. He's like, well, we have no way to arrest him. We have no proof of anything. And so we decided we're going to be in touch, and he drives back. And then media starts showing up. Huge news trucks start showing up outside. Everybody found out, because this was a huge story, where he was, and everybody wanted answers. Finally, the National Enquirer, they reached out and they said, hey, if you give us an exclusive story, if Travis speaks to us about what happened to him, we will get you out of here, we'll bring you to a private location, and we'll even pay to have Travis undergo a whole other battery of tests that are not typically done to see if they could figure out what had happened to him. And so they agree to go with the National Enquirer. So by the time he's actually sitting there looking at the National Enquirer, he's had a little bit of time to maybe let his memory kind of kick back in about what had happened. And he's having these flashes of memory of what happened over those 5 days, because initially all he could remember was seeing the craft and then being on the road 5 days later. And so when he's sitting down with the National Enquirer people, he begins to recall what actually happened over those 5 days. And so this is what he said happened. He said that he remembers getting out of the truck and walking up to this craft. And he remembers his crew members yelling at him to come back. He knew they were yelling at him to come back. He just wanted to look at the craft a little bit longer. And then right as he was about to turn around and head back, the craft started moving. This loud kind of mechanical, eerie sound is being made. And before he had a chance to run back, he gets hit with this lightning bolt of some kind. Then he remembers being in the presence of some doctors. He saw white lab coats, masks, and facial coverings, and he's kind of in and out of consciousness, and he's this orange light around him, but he definitely sees what looks like medical professionals, and he's thinking to himself, whatever happened with that ship, it must have hurt me, and my crew must have scooped me up and brought me to the hospital. And so in his kind of in and out state, he's aware that he's around medical professionals, at least what he believes are medical professionals. And at some point, his vision clears. It goes from foggy and he's in and out to being pretty much lucid. And he looks down at his chest, and there's a rectangular box sitting on his chest that he didn't recognize. It didn't really look like modern medical equipment. It just looked like this almost like rock sitting on his chest. And he looks at that, and then he looks up at one of the people who's wearing a mask, who's working on him, one of the medical professionals. And this person is working on this box, and then the person looks at Travis Walton and then leans in to look even closer at Travis Walton, and Travis is horrified. It was this grayish, thin, narrow-headed figure that was very short, maybe like 4 feet high, who was looking in at him, and its eyes were like slits, and it's looking at Travis. And Travis, who's unbelievably scared at this point, pushes everything off of him and rips out all the cords that are attached to him. He kind of topples off of this table that he was on, and he realizes he's in a fairly small room, and there's 3 of these humanoid creatures in the room with him. And he picks up the biggest instrument he can see next to the table that he was just laying on. He didn't know what it was, and he starts kind of wildly waving it at them and screaming to leave him alone, like, get away from me. And he's trying to make sense of what he's looking at, and the 3 figures in lab coats start walking closer and closer to him. And they're just kind of looking up at him, trying to study him a little bit. They get all the way up to him, and he's waving, and he's almost about to hit one of them when they just kind of abruptly turn around and leave the room, leaving him alone in this kind of examination room. And as soon as they leave, he watches them go down the little, outside the door, down the little hallway, and they turn left. And so he's practically paralyzed with fear, but he knows if he can't get out of this room, he's done for. And so finally, he kind of gets himself together and he walks past the examination table. He goes down the hallway outside of the door, and instead of going left where they went, he kind of sneaks off to the right and starts walking. And he comes to another room, and it's a room that has a single chair in it. It's this tiny little room with a chair, and the chair is turned away from him. He begins to peer around the chair, and he sees that no one is sitting there. So he goes in front of the chair, and he's like touching the wall, looking for a doorknob or any sort of mechanism that can get him out of this room. And he said, like, the room, it was like this perfectly flat. Everything was flat and smooth. There was no door handles. He couldn't find a way out. And he ultimately sees on the chair that it looks like there's some buttons on the chair itself. And he pushes all these buttons on the chair and nothing happens. And then in the doorway where he came in, suddenly a person, a man, appears in the doorway, who's wearing what looks like a spacesuit, like an astronaut suit. And Travis is so immediately relieved, even though the weirdness of him being in an astronaut suit is pretty high. But he's like, it's a human. And he doesn't know what to think about the fact that he's now excited to see a human, right? Like, it's terrifying that you were just around these non-humans, but he's like in panic mode now. He sees another human being and he runs over to him and he says, please, you gotta help me. I don't know where I am. You know, where are we? What is this? What's going on? And he notices that the eyes of this person inside of the spacesuit, it's a man who at least looks like a man, but his eyes are distant. He's not making eye contact with Travis. It's like he's in a trance. And he said his eyes just seemed off, like they weren't focused on him. It would be like if you're talking to someone, but they were like permanently looking away from you. There was just something off about him, and he never spoke. And so he's trying to ask this guy, like, where are we? And the guy takes him by the arm, and he just starts leading him back into the hall where he came from, and continued down the hall, not back towards the room where he was originally, but down the hall in the other direction. And they get to another door, and he opens it up, and Travis the whole time is like pleading with this guy to help him. And he thinks that this guy is helping him. He thinks that this is his savior. And he feels relieved that a human being, albeit a strange human being, is helping him. And eventually he stops asking him any questions because the guy in the spacesuit's just not reacting to him. They open this door and they go down into this huge hangar where there's all these spacecraft that look just like the one that he saw in the clearing, that Travis saw in the clearing. And they start walking down between all these spacecraft that are just hovering, much like they were hovering in the forest, seemingly able to just defy gravity. And the whole time, this guy in the spacesuit's saying nothing, and Travis is like, what is this? What are these craft? Is this military? Saying nothing. They walk to the far side of the hangar, and they open up another door, and they go into this bright white room. And there's 3 more human-like people with the strange eye thing going on in spacesuits that are standing there next to another medical table, and they're looking not at Travis, but their bodies are aimed in the direction of the door they came in through. Travis goes in and he sees these 3 and he thinks, these people are here to save me. Like, again, I feel relieved to see humans, albeit strange humans, but nonetheless humans. And the guy who had brought him in there continues to lead him over to the three other people, and they pick him up and they put him on the table. And he starts kind of resisting because he doesn't know what they're doing. They're not speaking. He's like, what are you doing? And they force him onto this table, and he's feeling pretty weak at this point. And they take a gas mask and they put it over his face, and then he blacks out. And his next memory after that is when he woke up on the road and had the light above him that flew away, and he had to run down to the payphone to call his brother. Travis did not immediately go and speak to the crew members that were there that night. It took quite a bit of time. He was talking to press. He was, doing interviews. The police wanted to talk to him. There's a lot going on. But he eventually got together with the other 6 crew members, and they all met up at Mike Rogers, the crew boss's house. And they just said, you got to tell us what happened. And so he sits down and he tells the story. All of them believed him. They didn't want to believe him, but they believed him because they saw the first half of the story. They saw it for themselves. And once he was done telling it, they didn't really have that many questions. They just felt bad. They felt like if they had just stayed there and taken Travis, he wouldn't have been taken, but they didn't know that. And so all of them would leave Mike's house that day, and they would all go their separate ways. They did not stay in touch. They went their separate ways. It was like this hugely traumatic event that even to this day, 40 plus years later, when they talk about it, they're often brought to tears. Ken Peterson, his interviews are particularly striking because when he talks about it, he's an older man now. And he says, to this day, I'm scared to look out my window because I'm afraid I'm going to see a spaceship. And he starts crying when he talks about it. I mean, this had a profound impact on these 7 men. And some of them didn't do so well. This whole story, it ruined their credibility. Even though this is the most believable alien abduction story, the truth is most people think it's a hoax. One of them, like his own family, basically disowned him because they felt so embarrassed about this whole story and they don't believe him. So if this was a hoax, like to what end? What did they get out of it? Nothing. It damaged their lives. Following this case over the span of 40 years, there would be 16 lie detector tests taken, 5 by Travis Walton and 11 by the remaining crew, and they would all pass. The one member of that initial polygraph set, when 5 had passed and 1 was inconclusive, he was retested, the same exact test, and he did pass. It's just one of those things where we're left with this incredible story where modern technology says they're telling the truth, but we can't fit that truth into what we think of as normal life. And so we've just decided that there's going to be a group of people that believe and there's going to be a group of people that don't. And you're left to pick which side you're on. So I'd love to hear